Well, good Monday, everybody. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Maybe right now I could take a minute to wrap up what I think the salient points are of the DH, or the Deuteronomistic history. That's the book of Deuteronomy, kind of combined with the historical books that show us how the Deuteronomic law plays out in history. So there's a couple of neat things in the book of Deuteronomy itself. Deuteronomy chapter 18 has the famous prophecy of a future prophet like Moses. Many of you know that the New Testament, especially the Gospel of Luke, goes to some lengths to show that the prophet like Moses is really Jesus. But if we were simply reading the Deuteronomic literature by itself, we probably would conclude at an earlier stage that that prophet could have been, the role could have been filled by Joshua. And so in this way, Joshua is a type of Jesus, both being representations of that prophet like Moses spoken of in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Now, this week when we get into the prophets, we're also going to see a very close tie-in with Jeremiah and the book of Deuteronomy, in particular Deuteronomy chapter 30, which is going to not only sort of sum up the various curses that are discussed in the Deuteronomic law in the previous chapters, but also really set the stage for the ultimate renewal, the kind of light at the end of the tunnel, the time when God will actually circumcise the hearts of Israel. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, this week, or last week rather, I asked you to kind of look for things in the story that really point to a very ambiguous portrayal of Israel's central institutions. And by Israel, I mean kind of Israel, greater Israel, you know, the two kingdoms, or at least the ideal unified kingdom, which eventually splits into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. But how is this portrayal of the central institutions of king and temple so ambiguous? Well, you did very well with the king part. You kind of all saw that David is constantly the standard bearer by which all the kings of Judah are judged. And yet, ironically, the text is not at all silent about the many shortcomings of David. And that itself is kind of an ambiguity. We also see that, you know, the kings of Judah, in the minds of the DH, the Deuteronomist historian, do many good things, but they, generally speaking, fail to do what's needed to be done about the high places. The high places being the sort of idolatrous shrines that are showing up all over the land. This is, in many ways, the central shortcoming of these kings. And again, this just shows that everything, in a certain sense, is a day late and a dollar short. As good as they do, they never do anything about the shrines. Well, of course, the one king who does something about the shrines is King Josiah. And indeed, King Josiah is so good that the text at one point in 2 Kings 23, 24 through 25 seems to flirt with the idea of making Josiah rather than David the standard bearer. But this never really seems to stick at this stage. At any rate, Josiah is killed in an untimely way on the plains of Megiddo, in a very, very tragic event of the great, hero reforming king who tried to bring back the law of Deuteronomy, which had been stuffed away inside the temple, to really reinstitutionalize it, and of course failed. And within a generation, all of his reforms are completely undone. So you can see that there's a lot of ambiguity, and indeed there's a lot of ambiguity about the establishment of a kingship to begin with. Going back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, God didn't ever really want there to be a king. He was happy ruling Israel himself as king through his high priest Samuel, who also, in a way, kind of doubles as prophet. So the establishment of the kingship is really, very much something that God didn't want. And yet at the same time, as we all know, God blesses the monarchy and eventually promises that it will be, in 2 Samuel 7:14, promises that it will be a permanent, indissoluble monarchy. However, there's another little ambiguity with that as well, because God, at the same time, has this little chastisement clause where he says if the king of David gets out of line, although his dynasty will last forever, I can chasten him with the rod. Well, how does this chastening clause work exactly? Is this consistent with the monarchy dying out completely as it did in the Babylonian exile, and with the hope of possibly returning? Well, apparently so. And you see here the same sort of tension between this idea of the eternal monarchy and this good behavior clause, that's really more Deuteronomistic in terms of its theology, and the necessary curses that must be borne for disobedience. You can see the same sort of tension of these two ideas of eternal blessing and contingent, behavior contingent eventualities, sort of woven together in Solomon's prayer of dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8. So I wanted you to see those things as well. Now, as for the temple itself, is also fraught with ambiguity. I don't think any of you saw, though, which was a little surprising to me, that when David originally gets the idea for the temple, what happens? Well, this is in let's see here, 2 Samuel 6 and 7. He goes to Samuel and says, I have this idea for the temple, and not Samuel, I'm sorry, Nathan. And Nathan says, yeah, great. God says God's all for it. Go ahead and do it. And then, come back a few verses later and says, well, God's been thinking about it. And then on second thought, thanks, but no thanks. I'm happy here living just in my tent, in my sanctuary. That's been fine for me. But on the other hand, I'm thinking about it more and more, and not you're not going to be the one that build it, but your son will. And he'll be the one that builds the temple and has the eternal dynasty. Of course, there's a little bit of ambiguity in this description also, concerning the temple. God was for it before he was against it, kind of like John Kerry, right? So there's a little bit of ambiguity about whether the temple itself was really a good idea or not. I don't mean to say in any way that the Deuteronomic history was ever anti-David or anti-temple, but they are a lot less pro-temple than you would expect them to be, given their position as in effect being the authors and the custodians not only of Israel's history but of Israel's sacred literature. Why don't we get a much more robust temple apologetic? We don't, and that's a little surprising. There's a lot of internal critique in the Bible by men who you would think would be the ones who'd be most apt to defend Israel's central institutions. And another little funny thing about the temple is, Solomon is of course the one who gets the commission to build the temple, and he does. But you can see here that in the lead up to the temple, that there's a little bit of a discussion about where the temple is going to be built and how this is going to happen. And you notice here that there's a story in 1 Kings 3, 1 through 4, and this is the story of Gibeon, and this is the great dream where Solomon asks for wisdom. Okay, and what's interesting is that all the people here, we're told, including the king, are sacrificing at high places, because there's no temple yet. And what's interesting is that there's already, in effect, this Deuteronomic law where you have this law of a central sanctuary in Deuteronomy 12. They don't need a temple to have a central sanctuary. They can still have a central sanctuary without a temple. So there's really no excuse for this idolatry. And yet, paradoxically, they're in effect blaming the absence of the temple on this. They're blaming people's idolatry on the absence of a temple. It's almost as though that there's a sense in which the temple is being established, as a channel for the idolatrous desires of the people, and not out of the sense of pure Deuteronomistic desire to love God and worship God with all one's heart, all one's soul, and all one's strength. It's very much like the idea of the king is also born out of this sort of idolatrous desire to be like all the other nations, and not to love God as your king with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. So you can see here that all of these central institutions of Israel are born, at the very moment of conception, even with this sort of ambiguity, this little hints of impurity, kind of distorted desire, misdirected desire to do good. God ultimately blesses them, but ultimately, the full blessing never comes really until there's this great purgation that has to happen. None of these institutions ultimately can survive very long under this sort of Deuteronomistic cloud. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to say about the Deuteronomic history today. We're going to look more at the prophets this week. The prophets are going to be the ones really to kind of sort out, if you will, how these various institutions of king, of temple, of land, all of these sorts of institutions that kind of surround Israel's central self-understanding and identification, how these are going to be resolved in an era in which, after the exile, they've all been taken away. How does this work vis-a-vis God's plan for his chosen people and the promise made to Abraham? That's what we're going to find out this week.